Rachel Shabi is a left-leaning British journalist, best known for her work with the Guardian newspaper, previously as Middle East correspondent and now as a commentator on British society and politics. She appears regularly on television as a commentator on Middle Eastern and British affairs, and she trains people from a diverse range of backgrounds on how to make a break into TV. In her critically acclaimed book, Not the Enemy, Rachel tracks the history of Mizrahi Jews in Israel. She describes herself to me as a migrant driven to succeed by her outsider status. I began by asking her about her parents, who moved to Israel from Iraq and then on to the UK.
They left Iraq as refugees when they went to Israel, as did many Iraqi Jews at that time. So they couldn't take any belongings or, essentially any assets with them. So they did start again in Israel. And then they decided to do that all over again in the UK in the early 70s when they moved with a family of 3 kids. But they did, my father was by that stage an engineer, so he was able to re-establish himself quite quickly. And I think, I quite often think that Britain in the UK, in the UK in the early 70s, there was that possibility to do that. And I'm not sure they would have been able to do that or even allowed to do that in today's climate. But definitely I am really proud of the fact that they managed to raise a family and start all over again in a different country, in a different culture, look after us all in that way.
And you were reading the news and fascinated by news as a young kid in the UK, which is what first got you interested in news?
I wasn't that interested in well, I don't think I was, but quite often I talk to people who I met during school and during university, and they point out that actually, yes, I was pretty opinionated even then. And I suppose when I look back to it, I was a teenager during years when Britain was very politicised. So I do remember things like, Thatcher coming to power and the miners' strike and the Falklands War. And I remember that did divide people, even at school. These were quite polarising things, and you very quickly established, I suppose, a political identity because there were those issues to sort of coalesce an identity around.
And you're a left-wing reporter. You work for the Guardian newspaper, right? How would you describe yourself?
I do describe myself as a left-wing reporter, but I think that comes with all kinds of caveats. I mean, I'm very interested in left-wing politics, and particularly grassroots left-wing politics, and always have been. So throughout my career in journalism, I've been following things like, the anti-globalization protests at the turn of the century, through to the protests against the Iraq War, climate change protests, anti-austerity protests, and eventually in the UK that culminated in, a political party, the Labour Party, being sort of representative of and a receptacle for that kind of grassroots politics, which was the first time in my lifetime that happened, which is what made it so interesting to me. But I do think, there is a thing when you're a left-wing writer, you're always, and I'm open about it, so when you're researching and reporting, you're always trying to find a way to test that or make sure it's not getting in the way. Is this thing true because I believe it, or is it true because it's actually empirically true? So I feel like I am always sort of testing my own beliefs in a way that people who don't come out and say they are left-wing or a particular political shade, they don't necessarily do that. Or also some people think that they are politically neutral when, in fact, the default, the neutral, is quite loaded in its own way too.
It allows you to put more passion into your writing as well, doesn't it? Because you've got this sense of cause behind it. You're not hiding behind this idea that you're an impartial, unopinionated reporter.
Well, I think that to some extent that's true, but I think the passion also comes from just exposure. And, that is one of the privileges of journalism, is that you are exposed to different people with different lives, and, you get to talk to all kinds of experts and all kinds of people around the country. And that creates its own passion because, you become interested in people's lives or in people's ideas or the development of their ideas. So I think that the passion for writing really is generated by exposure to other people and other ideas.
You're going to be bashful about this, but you're a very well regarded left-leaning writer and journalist here in the UK. But if you're able to pin that onto something, why do you think you've been successful?
So, I mean, I obviously don't see that in the same way, but I think that, so when I did a reporting stint in Israel and the Palestinian territories, I spent 5 years there. I wrote a book, but I was also reporting there for The Guardian. And I think that what happened there was that I consolidated this thing that I saw as an obstacle, which is that I'm such an outsider, and I couldn't really figure out how to make things work in journalism because I didn't know what the rules were, I didn't know what the process was, what the etiquette was. So I felt like by the time I got to Jerusalem and did that reporting, I consolidated the idea that actually that was an asset, that having an outsider's eye was quite useful. If you have an insider's ear, which I did in that region because of just who I am culturally and having access to languages, if you have that outsider's eye, it's quite useful and it is an asset. So I feel like during that period, I learned to own it a little bit. And that probably was useful in a UK context where there was a lot of mainstream media sort of reluctance or dismissiveness around Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party, so for the last 3 years since that has happened. And I feel like maybe being an outsider to that gave me a slightly different perspective.
Do you still feel like an outsider?
Yes and no. I mean, it's something that you have with you all the time, I think, if you're a migrant. It's not even that, it was such a long time ago, but it's something that stays with you as an identity. But I do feel that I belong to the UK and especially to London. And my father, when he was alive, would always say that London is just the best place to be if you are someone who is displaced. And that is very much how I feel about this city. So it kind of varies. It's an insider-outsider status, but I think I have much more comfort and ease with that at this stage than I have done for years.
So is that what drives your writing? You think more than anything, this idea that you're an outsider and you're trying to establish yourself all the time?
Definitely, that was a drive for many, many years. I really had the sense that I was banging on a wall and that it wasn't moving. But I really, really wanted it to move. So that was definitely a motivation for many years.
Was that the media industry or society here?
I think it's the media industry. I mean, it is, notoriously quite elitist, and I think it is getting better. So I think generations below me are, they do have this very similar kind of struggles, but perhaps there is more awareness in the media industry that is a problem. Whether or not it's redressed, that there's an awareness that is a problem, that it's very narrow type of person. Usually, sort of white, upper middle class, Oxbridge educated is the stereotype, or private school educated is that stereotype. So I do think that it's an industry thing, although perhaps now changing, hopefully.
So you also do some media training away from your journalism with young students, young people, a lot of the time. What do you tell them about breaking into an industry, particularly people from societies which aren't particularly represented within the media?
I do work with a lot of young people, and I do broadcast media training for them. So the idea is, if people are terrified of doing media, as I was, that there's ways to, there's techniques to override that and tricks to get beyond that. And
how did you do it?
Well, I had to do it because I wrote a book and forgot that I would have to publicise it, and then realised that I would need to do that. So I learnt to. I was terrified of public speaking.
Give me an example of getting out there and having to break that?
Well, I had to do a book launch and speak at the book launch, which was absolutely terrifying to me because I'd managed to hide behind print journalism for, at least a decade and got away with it. And suddenly I couldn't get away with it anymore. So I had to acquire that skill, I suppose.
How did you break through that moment where you had to stand up in front of all of your colleagues and counterparts and speak?
Well, I think what drove me through that again was this idea that, my book, I interviewed a lot of people in that book. It was a collection of people's experiences and stories, including my family, but also many, many others. And I suppose it was the responsibility to them, that got me over it, that, hang on, this isn't even about you. There are stories here that should be shared. So that, I think, is what got me beyond it. But also, I suppose, the realization that fear is always there, that you can't really stop feeling the fear, but you can manage it and you can make it work with you rather than against you, which is what it had been doing up until that point.
But your fear there is, again, being an outsider, isn't it? You don't feel qualified to stand in front of that very impressive group I'm sure you were in front of.
Yes, definitely. It's the classic imposter syndrome, that it's quite hard to shake off if you have that. But I think there's also something there about the fear of not being credible. So I'm always worried about not getting it right. Is this bit of research right? Have I checked this fact? Is it correct? Is what I'm saying accurate? And my fear, I think, is not being credible or losing credibility.
So what do you say to those young people in your training sessions?
So they quite often come from, I work with people from very different backgrounds, whether that's ethnicity or regional class, accents, gender, things that people are conscious of and are in some way keeping them locked out of doing broadcast. And
they feel held back by them as well.
I think a lot of people feel held back by these things because, media, there's a sense of entitlement to talk and to have a media voice that a lot of people don't have. And that is to do with, opportunity and class and diversity. A lot of people do feel locked out of the media for those reasons. So I train them in just how to get over that or override it. And I do talk about, structural biases that are operating in a media environment and how you can sort of go with them and not be held back by them, but actually, I suppose a lot of it is using the weight of your opponent to overwhelm them. It's that kind of thinking of you might be intimidated by someone else's perceived strength in that arena, but actually you can use that to overwhelm them and win the argument with. So it's a little bit martial artsy, I suppose, in that sense.
But also, I guess, making them aware that they will have their own concerns and insecurities as well. Everyone's got them.
I think that's a really key thing. And, Sir Laurence Olivier always said that the day he stopped feeling afraid was the day he stopped acting. And I think a lot of people, they feel they come across as being composed, but underneath they're really flustered and feeling really stressed out and nervous and anxious. So I think that realization is really helpful. And I always give a little bit of personal biography in those situations where I feel it's relevant, just to show people that, even someone who does do sort of flagship political programs in the UK still has all those anxieties. They don't go away. You just figure out how you can work with them. And for everyone, that will be different.
Also, newsrooms need different perspectives and points of view, and that's where the story ideas come from. So those hang-ups that, these young people you're working with have are actually an advantage more than anything else.
I think so, and it's always such a pleasure to work with people, especially young people who, I work a lot with people who are, in academia or university, and their fields of expertise are so extraordinary and so interesting. And I always come away thinking, well, I can't wait for those perspectives and those insights to get into our public conversation, because I feel like they're sorely lacking at the moment. So I think you're right that it is that you need people with different perspectives and different ways of thinking, and people who've pursued different fields of research, and whatever it is that has driven them to pursue that research so intently is going to be what makes that research so interesting to everybody else.
And are there any practical tips that you've come up with that go down really well? Things that you take for granted, but actually a revelation to a lot of the people you're training?
So there's a lot of it actually is that thing about unknowns. So, I get quite stressed about things that I don't know. So quite a lot of the sessions will be, okay, this is what it looks like. This is what will happen. This is what where the cameras will be. This is what physically will happen to you as you walk through that environment, and this is how you can manage bits that that make you nervous. So a lot of it really is just breaking down what the situation looks like, so that can free up headspace that would otherwise be anxious about that. You can free it up to concentrate on other things like preparing what you're going to say.
So do you think when considering how to sort of forge ahead and make a success of yourself, that do you think we're sometimes too focused on our ambitions and what we're aiming at, and not focused enough on what's going to drive us towards it? Or what would you be your secret to success from what you've experienced and seen in other people?
I think that's really true, and I can see it. I can see it as such a strong driver in people I work with who've spent 5, 6, 7 years on one research subject. So you have to be into it if you're going to sustain that level of attention and energy. And that was something that when I wrote my book, people said to me was, you have to really be into this subject, because you're going to be sick of it. You're going to be writing these chapters and then editing them and reading them and rereading them. You're going to be so sick of your own words. You actually really need to care about the subject to get you through that. And I really think that was true in hindsight, that's really what sustained me through it, was really caring about the subject.
But also, I guess, not actually getting to the end and writing the book. You didn't want to go back to not being a writer. Is that? I know it's a bit complex, but you didn't want to go back to the past where you didn't have a book. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I also don't want to go back to the past where I'm worried about not feeling entitled to have a voice, because I feel like that was so paralyzing. That was completely the wrong kind of fear, or the wrong use of fear, that it held me back for such a long time. So I really don't want to go back to feeling that way. And I certainly don't want other people to feel that way either.
But you pushed through, and then once you're on your way, you've written the book, you'd stood up in front of this audience and talked about your book. Was that the big hurdle for you?
I think it was. I think publicising the book was a real professional leap for me, because suddenly I had to engage with broadcast media in a way that I had managed to avoid up until then very well. And it was a different time, so I got away with, hiding behind print, perhaps for longer than I would have in this era. But definitely that was a leap in terms of getting into a different media, and then being asked into broadcast studios as an expert on the Middle East, so being asked to comment on the situation. So this was during the Arab uprisings, and again, sort of Israel and the Palestinian conflict came up also. So learning how to do that and feel comfortable with it, I think, was a bit of a spurt as well.
Do you still get nervous?
Oh yeah, but I welcome that, and I also have a feeling of awe, I suppose. Every time I walk into a studio, it never goes away. You walk into a TV studio or a radio studio, and you just think, this is amazing. I'm really lucky. This is an amazing opportunity, and I hope that I can do it justice.
You do.
That's
every time you walk in. Rachel, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.